The Black Hawk helicopter cut through the Afghan night like a blade through silk, its rotors beating a rhythm that had become Lieutenant Mara Vance's heartbeat over the past 18 months. She sat in the cargo hold, eyes closed, running through the mission parameters one final time. Muscle memory guided her hands as she checked her rifle, a customized M4 carbine that had saved her life more times than she could count. Click. Magazine seated. Charging handle racked. Safety on. The familiar routine calmed the pre-mission adrenaline coursing through her veins. Across from her, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reeves watched with barely concealed approval. 2 years ago, he'd been one of the loudest voices opposing women in SEAL teams. Then he'd seen Mara complete Hell Week without ringing the bell, watched her outshoot half the instructors at the range, and witnessed her carry a 200-pound dummy 5 miles during the final training evolution while other candidates quit around her. Respect wasn't given in the teams. It was earned in blood, sweat, and an absolute refusal to quit. Mara had earned it. 5 minutes, the crew chief's voice crackled through their headsets. Mara opened her eyes, scanning her team. 8 operators, the best of the best. Petty Officer First Class Danny Torres checked his breaching charges for the 3rd time. Typical Torres, meticulous to a fault. Petty Officer Second Class Jake Sullivan cleaned his rifle optic with the obsessive precision of a man who'd once missed a shot because of a smudge. The others prepared in focused silence, each man a coiled spring ready to explode into controlled violence. This wasn't Mara's first mission, not by a long shot. She'd been operational for 14 months, completing 23 direct action raids, 7 hostage rescues, and countless reconnaissance operations. But tonight felt different. The intelligence was too perfect, the target too convenient. A high-value Taliban commander, responsible for an IED attack that killed 12 Marines and wounded 17 more, supposedly hiding in a compound just 40 miles from the Pakistani border. The NSA had intercept data, informants on the ground, even thermal satellite imagery showing the right number of heat signatures. Too perfect. Vance, Reeves leaned forward, his weathered face barely visible in the red interior lighting. You got that look again. What look, Chief? The one that says you're about to tell me something I don't want to hear. Mara permitted herself a small smile. Just running scenarios. If I were Taliban and I knew we were hunting this guy, where would I set up? You'd make the compound a kill zone, Reeves said, his expression darkening. Overlapping fields of fire, prepositioned heavy weapons, multiple escape routes. He paused. You think this is a trap? I think it's convenient, and convenient gets people killed. Sullivan looked up from his rifle. Intel's solid, Lieutenant. 3 independent sources confirmed the target's location. 3 sources that could all be fed by the same network, Mara countered. These guys aren't stupid. They've been fighting superpowers for 40 years. 2 minutes, the crew chief announced. Commander Hayes's voice cut through the debate on the command channel. All stations, be advised, Predator drone has eyes on target. Thermal shows 9. Repeat 9 heat signatures inside the compound. Pattern of life consistent with security detail. No indication of unusual activity. Reeves caught Mara's eye and shrugged. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe the intel was solid. But her gut, the same instinct that had warned her about an ambush in Helmand Province 6 months ago, saving 4 lives, screamed that something wasn't right. The helicopter began its descent and Mara pushed her concerns aside. Mission focus. That's what separated SEALs from everyone else. The ability to compartmentalize fear, doubt, and hesitation, channeling everything into the objective. Her fingers found the small compass her father had given her before she deployed, the same compass he'd carried through Desert Storm. A reminder that she came from a warrior family. Her grandfather had stormed Normandy. Her father had fought in Iraq. Now it was her turn to add to the legacy. The skids touched rocky ground with barely a whisper. Before the helicopter fully settled, 8 shadows poured out into the darkness, weapons up, moving in perfect synchronization. The Black Hawk lifted off immediately, disappearing into the night sky, leaving them alone in hostile territory. Mara took point position, her night vision goggles transforming the moonless night into shades of green. The compound sat 2 clicks ahead, nestled in a valley surrounded by steep ridges, tactically defensible, which made sense for a high-value target. But those same ridges could hide 100 fighters. They moved in a tactical column, each operator maintaining precise spacing. No words were needed. They trained together for thousands of hours until they functioned as a single organism. Hand signals conveyed everything: halt, danger area, building ahead. At the 1-click mark, Mara raised her fist. The team froze. Through her scope, she scanned the compound. Mud brick walls, typical Afghan construction. A main building with a courtyard. 2 smaller structures. 1 guard visible on the roof, smoking a cigarette. Sloppy security. Too sloppy for someone protecting a high-value commander. "Command, this is Neptune 7, Reeves whispered into his radio. "We have eyes on target compound. Single sentry visible. Recommend surveillance before breach." Static, then Hayes's response. "Negative, Neptune 7. Rules of engagement are clear. Target is time-sensitive. You are cleared hot. Execute on your discretion." Mara felt ice slide down her spine. Time-sensitive meant the target might move soon. It also meant command was pressuring them to move fast. Fast got people killed. But orders were orders. Reeves looked at her and she saw her own doubt reflected in his eyes. Then his expression hardened. "Let's do this. Tors, Sullivan, Vance, you're with me. Alpha Element, set perimeter security." The team split. 4 operators melted into the darkness to establish an outer cordon. Mara moved with Reeves, Tors, and Sullivan toward the compound, every sense screaming as they approached the walls. The night was too quiet. No dogs barking, no sounds of normal life, just silence and the whisper of wind across stone. Mara's finger moved to her trigger guard as they reached the breach point. Something was wrong. She was right. And in 60 seconds, everything would go to hell. Tors placed the breaching charge on the compound's wooden door with practiced precision, his hands steady despite the tension radiating through every operator. Mara covered the roofline, her rifle trained on the guard who'd finally stubbed out his cigarette and moved to the far corner. Too convenient. The thought flashed through her mind again, but there was no time to voice it. "Breacher up," Tors whispered into his mic. "Execute," Reeves commanded. The explosion shattered the night's silence. The door disintegrated in a flash of light and thunder. Sullivan was first through the breach, Mara right behind him, her rifle sweeping left as his swept right. The room was empty except for scattered furniture and "Contact rear," someone screamed over the radio. Then the world exploded. The sound came first. A freight train roar that Mara's brain recognized as RPGs a split second before they impacted. The compound's back wall erupted in a fireball that sent stone and shrapnel screaming through the air. More explosions followed in rapid succession, perfectly timed, perfectly placed. The entire courtyard became a kill zone illuminated by muzzle flashes from 3 different directions. "Ambush, ambush," Reeves shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of automatic weapons fire. Mara dove behind a stone pillar as bullets chewed into the ground where she'd been standing. Tracer rounds carved red lines through the darkness, crisscrossing the compound in a web of death. This wasn't a firefight, it was an execution ground. The Taliban had turned the compound into a carefully designed trap, and they'd walked straight into it. "Alpha Element status," Reeves barked into his radio. Static, then screaming, then nothing. Sullivan returned fire from behind an overturned cart, his rifle barking in controlled 3-round bursts. "We're cut off from the others. At least 20 hostiles, maybe more." More like 30, Mara thought, her tactical brain still functioning despite the chaos. She identified muzzle flashes from the surrounding ridges. Machine gun positions that had been invisible during their approach, now revealed by their own fire. They'd been set up, lured here with false intelligence, and now they were paying the price. "Tors, we need to move," she shouted, spotting a gap in the enemy fire pattern. "Window 3 o'clock." Tors nodded, pulling a fragmentation grenade from his vest. He cooked it for 2 seconds, a dangerous move that prevented the enemy from throwing it back, then hurled it toward a cluster of Taliban fighters pouring through a side entrance. The explosion bought them precious seconds. Mara sprinted for the window, covering Sullivan and Tors as they followed. A round cracked past her ear so close she felt the heat. Another sparked off her helmet, knocking her vision sideways. She kept moving. Stopping meant dying. They crashed through into another room, smaller, with a single door leading to what looked like a storage area. Reeves was already there, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, his rifle never stopping its steady rhythm of controlled fire. "Alpha elements pinned down 200 meters north," he said, his voice tight. "QRF is inbound but taking heavy fire. We're on our own for at least 20 minutes. 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours. Tors slapped a fresh magazine into his rifle. "We can't hold here, Chief. They'll flank us in 90 seconds. "Agreed. We moved to that cave system we passed on infill, high ground, defensible position." Reeves looked at each of them. "Leapfrog movement. Mara, you're first. Go." She burst through the door into the courtyard, immediately drawing fire. Rounds snapped and cracked around her as she sprinted for the compound's eastern wall. Behind her, Reeves and Sullivan laid down suppressing fire, their weapons roaring. She reached the wall and took a firing position, providing cover as Sullivan ran. That's when she saw the RPG. SULLIVAN, DOWN. He dove, but not fast enough. The rocket-propelled grenade impacted 5 feet to his left. The explosion picked him up and slammed him into the wall. He crumpled, not moving. "Danny's hit," Tors screamed, breaking from cover. Everything seemed to move in slow motion. Tors reached Sullivan, checking for a pulse. Mara saw the Taliban fighter on the roofline adjusting his aim, his RPG launcher swinging toward her teammates. She fired twice. The fighter dropped, but another appeared. Then another. "Fall back to the cliff edge," Reeves commanded, dragging Sullivan's limp form. "We'll make our stand there." They moved as one, a fighting retreat through hell. Tors took a round through his leg but kept moving, limping, and firing. Mara's rifle ran dry. She transitioned to her sidearm without breaking stride, putting rounds into anything that moved. Her world narrowed to the next 3 feet, the next target, the next second of survival. The eastern wall of the compound butted up against a natural cliff, a 30-foot drop into a ravine filled with rocks and thorn bushes. Not ideal, but better than staying in the kill zone. They could rappel down, use the ravine for cover, work their way back to friendly lines. That's when the world ended. The explosion came from beneath them, a massive IED they'd somehow missed, or perhaps triggered by their movement. The entire eastern wall disintegrated. Stone, fire, and pressure wave lifted Mara off her feet like she weighed nothing. She felt herself flying, tumbling through space, the night sky and ground switching places in a dizzying kaleidoscope. Time stretched. She saw Reeves thrown sideways into the cave entrance they'd been heading for, saw Tors and Sullivan disappear into darkness, saw her rifle spinning away into the void. Then she was falling, the cliff edge far above, the ravine rushing up to meet her. She hit the slope hard, her body smashing against rocks. She tumbled, rolled, bounced. Something snapped in her chest, ribs, definitely ribs. Her shoulder dislocated with a pop she felt more than heard. Shrapnel tore into her thigh. Her helmet cracked against stone and the world flashed white. She slid, tumbled, fell another 10 feet into a dry riverbed choked with thorns and debris. Branches tore at her uniform, her exposed skin. She came to rest wedged between 2 boulders, staring up at a sky that swam in and out of focus. Above, on the cliff edge, she heard voices. Taliban fighters shouting in Pashto, gunfire sporadic now. Her teammates calling for her over the radio, their voices desperate and distant. Vance, Vance, respond. She tried to move, tried to reach for her radio. Pain exploded through her body so intense that darkness swallowed the edges of her vision. She tasted copper, blood in her mouth. Her hand found the radio on her chest, broken, completely shattered. Vance is down, I don't see her. She went over the edge. Is she alive? I can't see her, too much smoke. More explosions, more gunfire. The voices faded, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in her ears. Mara tried to stay conscious, tried to move, but her body wouldn't respond. The last thing she heard before darkness claimed her was Reeves's voice, cracking with emotion she'd never heard from the hardened chief before. Neptune 7 to command. We have one KIA confirmed. Lieutenant Vance is down. Repeat, Vance is down. We're taking heavy casualties, requesting immediate QRF and air support. Then nothing. Just darkness, pain, and the cold embrace of unconsciousness. Commander James Hayes stared at the casualty report on his desk, the words blurring together as exhaustion and grief pulled at his consciousness. 4 days. 4 days since Operation Neptune Spear had gone sideways, turning from a surgical strike into a nightmare that had cost him some of his best operators. The coffee in his mug had gone cold hours ago, but he lifted it anyway, the bitter liquid doing nothing to wash away the taste of failure. Lieutenant Mara Vance's personnel file lay open beside the report, her academy graduation photo showing a young woman with determined eyes and a slight smile, completely unaware of the fate that awaited her in these godforsaken mountains. The brass back in Virginia Beach wanted answers, wanted to know how intelligence could have been so catastrophically wrong, but Hayes didn't care about politics or blame right now. He cared about the fact that he'd sent 8 operators into hell, and only 4 had made it back alive. The knock on his door was soft, almost apologetic. "Come," Hayes said, his voice rough from shouting orders during the failed rescue attempts. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Park entered, her face drawn with the same sleepless exhaustion that plagued everyone on base. She carried a folder that Hayes recognized immediately, the one they used for memorial services. "Sir, the notification officers have contacted Lieutenant Vance's family. Her parents are flying in from Virginia. The service is scheduled for Saturday at Arlington." She paused, setting the folder on his desk with visible reluctance. "The chaplain needs approval for the ceremony details." "She's still listed as MIA," Hayes said sharply, knowing even as he spoke that he was grasping at straws. "Until we recover a body, she's missing, not dead." Park's expression was gentle but firm, the look of someone who delivered too many death notifications to harbor false hope. "Sir, it's been 4 days. The Taliban released a statement claiming they killed an American female soldier. The footage from the Predator drone showed her going over that cliff in a 100-pound combat load. The fall alone," she stopped, seeing Hayes's jaw clench. "Sir, I know you trained her personally, but we have to face reality. 3 operators witnessed her fall." Chief Reeves himself made the KIA call. "We've sent 4 reconnaissance patrols into that sector, and they found nothing but blood and torn equipment." Hayes stood abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked the base. Outside, life continued its military rhythm, helicopters landing and taking off, convoys departing for patrol, Marines running morning PT. Somewhere out there in those brutal mountains that had swallowed so many lives over the decades, Mara Vance lay dead or dying, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. "She was the best operator I've trained in 20 years, he said quietly. "You know what she did during Bud S. There was a candidate who broke his leg during Hell Week, refused to quit. Instructors were about to pull him when Vance carried him and her own boat during the next evolution. Carried a 220-pound man and a piece of her boat for 3 miles. The instructors failed her for that evolution, said she broke protocol, but she didn't care. That's who she was. That's why this is so hard, sir, Park said. But her teammates need closure. The team needs it. Reeves, Torres, and Sullivan are still trapped in that cave system, holding out until we can extract them. They've lost enough. Don't make them carry the guilt of leaving her behind any longer than necessary. Hayes turned back and Park saw something in his eyes that made her take an involuntary step back. Those men are trapped because they refuse to leave without her. Reeves took shrapnel to the chest trying to reach her position. They're heroes, every one of them, but don't tell me they need closure. What they need is their teammate back. He picked up the memorial folder and dropped it in his desk drawer without opening it. Prepare the service if you must, but I'm not signing off on anything until we have confirmation. Understood? Yes, sir, Park said, recognizing the dismissal. She headed for the door, then paused. Sir, for what it's worth, I hope you're right, I really do. After she left, Hayes pulled up the drone footage on his computer for perhaps the 100th time, watching the thermal images of the firefight. He saw the moment when the wall exploded, saw the white heat signature that was Mara Vance tumble over the cliff edge and disappear into the darker thermal shadows of the ravine below. He froze the frame, enhanced it, searched for any sign of movement afterward. Nothing, just static thermal patterns of cooling rock and vegetation. The Taliban had swarmed the area within minutes, making any immediate rescue impossible. By the time the QRF fought through, there was no trace of her except blood on the rocks and her shattered radio found wedged between boulders. Hayes closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment of grief he'd never show his command, then opened them with renewed determination. Something in his gut, the same instinct that had kept him alive through 3 deployments, refused to accept that she was gone. 12 miles away, in a ravine that smelled of death and thorn bushes, Mara Vance's eyes snapped open and she gasped, her lungs screaming for air. Pain crashed over her in waves so intense that for several seconds she couldn't think, couldn't process where she was or what had happened. Her vision swam with red and black spots, her body one massive bruise wrapped around broken bones. She tried to move and agony lanced through her chest, broken ribs, at least 3, maybe more. Her left shoulder hung at an unnatural angle, dislocated when she'd hit the rocks. Her right thigh was warm and wet with blood, shrapnel embedded deep in the muscle. Every breath was torture, every slight movement sent fresh spikes of pain through her nervous system. The sun was high overhead, burning down into the ravine with merciless heat that had her uniform soaked with sweat. 12 hours, her tactical brain calculated. She'd been unconscious for at least 12 hours, which meant severe concussion, probably internal bleeding, definitely dehydration already setting in. She was wedged between 2 boulders, hidden from view by overhanging thorn bushes, pure luck or maybe divine intervention, because it was the only reason the Taliban search parties hadn't found her. Above, she could hear voices speaking Pashto, boots crunching on rock as fighters continued to patrol the area. They were looking for bodies, looking for equipment, looking for anything they could use for propaganda or intelligence. Mara forced herself to remain absolutely still despite every instinct screaming to move, to run, to escape. The slightest sound would bring them down on her, and in her current condition, she couldn't fight off a child, let alone train fighters. She counted the footsteps as they passed overhead. 6 men, maybe 7, weapons rattling, talking about the American soldiers they'd killed, laughing about the female operator who'd fallen to her death. They were 20 feet away, close enough that she could smell their cigarette smoke drifting down. When the voices finally faded into the distance, Mara allowed herself to assess her situation with brutal honesty. She was severely injured alone, at least 15 miles behind enemy lines with no radio, no support, and no way to call for help. Her rifle was gone, lost in the fall, but she still had her sidearm, a Sig Sauer P226 with 2 magazines. Her combat knife was somehow still strapped to her calf. Her medical kit had partially torn open, scattering supplies, but she managed to gather what remained: a tourniquet, some gauze, a morphine syringe, and antiseptic wipes. Not nearly enough for the injuries she'd sustained, but it would have to do. The morphine called to her, promising relief from the agony, but she resisted. She needed her mind clear, needed to think, needed to survive. Her hand found the small compass her father had given her, miraculously unbroken in its pouch. She clutched it like a talisman, remembering his words before deployment. "This brought me home from Iraq. Now it'll bring you home too." But home felt impossibly far away as Mara lay in that ravine, broken and bleeding, listening to enemy fighters hunting for her corpse above. The first thing Mara had to do was relocate her shoulder, and she knew it was going to be worse than anything she'd experienced so far. She'd done this once before during SEER training: survival, evasion, resistance, escape, when an instructor had deliberately dislocated her shoulder to teach her how to fix it in the field, but that had been controlled, with medical personnel standing by in case something went wrong. Here, wedged between rocks in enemy territory with possible internal bleeding and definitely broken ribs, there was no safety net, no backup plan. She found a sturdy branch among the debris, positioned it against the boulder, and bit down on a piece of her torn sleeve. Then, gritting her teeth until her jaw ached, she pulled her arm outward and rotated it against the branch, using her body weight as leverage. The pain was transcendent, a white-hot spike that drove through her entire body and exploded behind her eyes. She felt the joint resist, then suddenly pop back into place with a sickening crunch that made her vision go dark around the edges. The scream that wanted to tear from her throat came out as a muffled whimper against the fabric, and for several long seconds she simply shook with the aftershocks of agony, tears streaming down her dirt-caked face. But it was done, the shoulder back in its socket, and though it throbbed with a deep ache that promised weeks of recovery, at least she could move it now. Next came the shrapnel wound in her thigh, and this required a steadier hand than she currently possessed. The metal fragment was embedded at least 2 inches deep, surrounded by torn muscle and steadily leaking blood that had already soaked through her uniform pants. She used her knife to cut away the fabric, revealing the full extent of the damage: a jagged piece of metal about the size of her thumb, probably from the IED that had destroyed the wall. Leaving it in risked infection and further tissue damage, but pulling it out risked arterial bleeding that could kill her in minutes. Mara made the calculation quickly, her medical training cutting through the pain and fear. Better to bleed fast and have a chance to stop it than die slowly from sepsis. She poured antiseptic over the wound, packed gauze around the shrapnel, then gripped the metal with her fingers and pulled in one smooth motion. Blood gushed immediately, dark and arterial, and she slapped the gauze down hard, applying pressure with one hand while fumbling for the tourniquet with the other. Her fingers felt thick and clumsy, her vision tunneling as blood loss and shock threatened to drag her under, but she got the tourniquet around her thigh and cranked it tight until the bleeding slowed to a seep. She packed the wound with the remaining gauze, wrapped it with torn strips from her shirt, and allowed herself 30 seconds of rest before forcing herself to continue the brutal inventory of her injuries. The broken ribs she couldn't do anything about except wrap them tightly with more torn fabric, each breath a reminder of how close she'd come to dying and how close she still was. Her head pounded with a concussion that made her nauseous and dizzy, but concussions healed or they didn't, and there was nothing to do but push through. Various cuts and bruises covered her body like a roadmap of violence, but none were life-threatening. She'd survived the fall, survived the initial assessment, and now came the hard part: staying alive long enough to matter. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting the ravine in long shadows, and Mara knew she needed to move before darkness fell. The Taliban would have patrols out all night, and staying in one place was a death sentence. She checked her pistol, making sure sand and debris hadn't compromised it, and was relieved to find it functional. 15 rounds between 2 magazines, not much, but better than nothing. Her knife was razor-sharp, her compass still worked, and somewhere deep inside her broken body, the fire that had carried her through Bud S still burned. That's when she heard it, a sound so faint she almost missed it over the ringing in her ears. Gunfire, distant but distinct, coming from the northwest. Not the scattered shots of a patrol or hunters, but controlled bursts, the rhythm of trained operators conserving ammunition. Her teammates. They were still alive, still fighting, and from the sound pattern they were pinned down and running low on ammo. Mara pulled herself up using the boulder for support, her legs shaking with the effort, and scanned the ravine walls until she found a position that offered a view of the surrounding terrain. Using hand-over-hand movement that sent fresh daggers of pain through her injured shoulder and ribs, she climbed 15 feet up the ravine wall to a small ledge hidden by overhanging rocks. From here she could see the valley spread out before her, the compound they'd raided now swarming with Taliban fighters, and beyond it, the cave system where she could see muzzle flashes, her teammates making a desperate stand. Through sheer force of will, Mara stayed on that ledge for the next 6 hours, watching, learning, mapping the enemy positions in her mind. She counted 32 distinct Taliban fighters, possibly more inside buildings she couldn't see. They had the cave surrounded but weren't pressing the attack. They were waiting, letting thirst and ammunition depletion do their work. Smart tactics, and it meant her teammates had days at most, possibly only hours. She watched the patrol patterns, noted which fighters were alert and which were complacent, identified their command structure by observing who gave orders and who followed. An old Toyota pickup truck served as their mobile command post, with what appeared to be a commander coordinating movements via radio. They had RPGs, machine guns, and enough ammunition to hold their position indefinitely. Against this, Mara had a pistol with 15 rounds, a knife, and a body that could barely walk, let alone fight. The tactical situation was impossible by any objective measure, but Mara had stopped believing in impossible somewhere around hour 70 of Hell Week, when instructors had screamed that she didn't belong, that she should quit, that no woman could do what she was attempting. She'd proven them wrong then by refusing to accept their reality, by creating her own through sheer stubborn determination. Now, watching her brothers trapped and dying while the enemy celebrated their impending victory, she felt that same cold fire ignite in her chest. Command thought she was dead, memorial services were probably already being planned, and her parents would receive a folded flag and empty condolences. The Taliban fighters laughed and smoked, confident in their victory. Her teammates were running out of time, out of hope, out of everything except the will to survive one more hour. But they were wrong, all of them, because Mara Vance wasn't dead. She was angry, she was hurt, and she was about to become the Taliban's worst nightmare. As the sun set and darkness crept across the valley, she began to plan, her mind working through scenarios and contingencies with the cold precision of a predator stalking prey. She couldn't call for help, couldn't wait for rescue that wasn't coming, couldn't expect anything except what she could create with her own 2 hands. One operator against 30+ enemy fighters in fortified positions, the kind of odds that military textbooks said were suicide, the kind of situation where the smart move was to evade and escape, to save yourself and let the dead bury the dead. But SEALs didn't leave SEALs behind, and that wasn't just a motto or a nice sentiment to put on recruiting posters. It was a blood oath, a sacred promise that meant you brought your brothers home or died trying. Mara checked her pistol one more time, tested her injured leg's ability to bear weight, and smiled grimly into the gathering darkness. The Taliban thought they'd won, thought the American ghosts who'd raided their compound were finished. They were about to learn that the most dangerous operator on any battlefield wasn't the one with the most weapons or the best position. It was the one with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The night belonged to Mara now, transformed from helpless victim to apex predator by the simple act of choosing to fight rather than flee. She moved through the darkness like smoke, every step calculated to avoid loose rocks and dry vegetation that might give away her position. The pain was still there, a constant companion that threatened to overwhelm her with each movement, but she'd learned to compartmentalize it, to acknowledge the agony without letting it control her decisions. Her injured leg dragged slightly, leaving a faint trail in the dust that she carefully obscured, and her wrapped ribs protested every breath. But none of that mattered because 300 meters away, her brothers were dying, and she was the only thing standing between them and a shallow grave in these godforsaken mountains. The Taliban had settled into a predictable rhythm, their confidence making them sloppy in ways that professional soldiers never were. They posted guards but didn't rotate them frequently. They built fires that destroyed their night vision. They talked and laughed loud enough to mask the sounds of someone moving through the darkness toward them. Mara's first target was a sentry posted on a ridge overlooking the cave entrance. A young fighter who couldn't have been more than 20, smoking a cigarette and occasionally firing random shots toward the cave to keep the Americans pinned down. She watched him for 15 minutes, timing his movements, nodding that he checked his phone every few minutes, the screen's glow making him night blind. When he turned to light another cigarette, Mara was already moving, her knife in hand, closing the 20-foot gap between them in absolute silence. He never heard her coming, never knew death had arrived until her hand clamped over his mouth, and the blade found the soft spot beneath his jaw, driving upward into his brain. He died without a sound, his cigarette falling from nerveless fingers, and Mara lowered him gently to the ground before dragging his body behind a boulder. She took his AK-47, checked the magazine, 28 rounds, nearly full, and added his spare magazines to her rapidly growing arsenal. 2 fragmentation grenades hung from his vest, along with a radio that crackled with periodic check-ins in Pashto. The second kill came 30 minutes later, another sentry positioned to watch the western approach, and this one was more alert, more professional, scanning his sector with the discipline of someone who'd survived previous firefights. Mara couldn't get close without being spotted, so she adapted her tactics, using one of the captured grenades to create a diversion 50 meters to his left. When the grenade detonated and he turned to investigate, she put 2 rounds from the AK into his back, the suppressed shots barely audible over the echo of the explosion. The other Taliban fighters would hear the grenade and assume their companion had engaged the Americans trying to escape, giving her precious minutes before they realized something was wrong. She took his position, his ammunition, his radio, building her capabilities one dead enemy at a time. The radios chattered constantly now, voices calling for the 2 missing sentries, but in the confusion and darkness, no one could pinpoint where the threats were coming from. By the time the first hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon, Mara had eliminated 6 Taliban fighters and accumulated an impressive arsenal: 3 AK-47s with spare magazines, a PKM machine gun with 200 rounds, 6 grenades, and a captured RPG with 2 rockets. More importantly, she'd mapped their entire defensive perimeter in her mind, identified their ammunition caches, and located their command post in that Toyota pickup. The Taliban were starting to panic now, their radio chatter frantic as they realized something was hunting them in the darkness, something that killed silently and disappeared like smoke. They doubled their patrols, pulled fighters in from the outer perimeter, which was exactly what Mara wanted. Concentrated targets were easier to hit with explosives. She'd positioned the captured weapons at 3 different locations around the Taliban perimeter, creating the illusion of multiple attackers. And now, she prepared to escalate from harassment to full-scale assault. The ammunition cache was her primary target, a small shed where the Taliban had stored extra RPG rounds, machine gun belts, and boxes of AK ammunition. Taking it out would cripple their ability to sustain a prolonged fight, and more importantly, would create chaos she could exploit. Mara approached from the north, moving through a dry streambed that offered concealment, dragging her injured leg and gritting her teeth against the pain that threatened to make her pass out. She'd fashioned an improvised explosive device from 3 grenades taped together with spare ammunition packed around them, a crude but effective bomb that would turn the shed into a fireball. Setting the timer, a simple friction fuse she'd made from matches and cigarette tobacco taken from one of the dead sentries, gave her 60 seconds to reach minimum safe distance, which in her current condition meant she'd be cutting it extremely close. She placed the device against the shed's wall, lit the fuse, and began limping back toward cover as fast as her ruined body would allow. 30 seconds. Her leg gave out and she fell, scrambling back to her feet, precious seconds ticking away. 45 seconds. She dove behind a boulder just as the world turned orange and the shockwave slammed into her, the explosion far larger than she'd anticipated. The shed disintegrated, and the ammunition inside began cooking off, sending tracers and explosions cascading in every direction. Taliban fighters ran toward the fire, shouting, trying to save their supplies, and Mara used the chaos to reposition to her second weapons cache. From this new position, elevated on a ridgeline with the captured PKM machine gun, she had clear fields of fire into the compound where most of the fighters had gathered. She took a breath, steadied the weapon against a rock, and opened fire. The PKM roared, spitting 7.62 rounds into the massed Taliban fighters at a rate of 600 rounds per minute. Men fell, scattered, dove for cover as Mara walked her fire across their positions. She fired in controlled bursts, conserving ammunition, switching targets as they presented themselves. Return fire started coming her way, bullets snapping through the air around her position, but she'd already planned her exit route. She emptied the belt, approximately 60 rounds in 10 seconds of sustained fire, then grabbed the AK-47 she'd positioned here and crawled along the ridgeline to her next position before the Taliban could coordinate their response. Behind her, she heard screaming, heard leaders shouting orders, heard the beautiful sound of an enemy in disarray. At her third position, she had the RPG, and she'd identified the perfect target during her reconnaissance, the Toyota pickup that served as their mobile command post. The commander was there now. She could see him through the scope of a captured rifle, gesturing wildly, trying to organize a defense against an enemy he couldn't see. Mara shouldered the RPG, acquired her target, and fired. The rocket streaked across 200 meters in less than 2 seconds, impacting directly on the pickup's cab. The explosion was spectacular, sending flames and debris 50 feet into the air, and with it went the Taliban's command structure. Without leadership, without ammunition, and facing an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once, the fighters began to panic. Some fled into the hills, abandoning their positions. Others hunkered down, firing wildly at shadows. A few brave souls tried to organize a counterattack, but they had no idea where to attack or how many enemies they faced. Mara used their confusion to approach the cave system where her teammates were trapped, moving through the chaos with a ghost silence. She could see the cave entrance now, could hear voices inside, American voices, weak but alive. She needed to reach them, needed to let them know help had arrived, but between her and that cave were still at least 15 Taliban fighters who hadn't fled, the hardcore veterans who wouldn't run no matter what. These were the dangerous ones, the true believers who'd fought Americans before and survived, and they were already regrouping, setting up defensive positions around the cave entrance with interlocking fields of fire. Getting to her teammates would require crossing 200 meters of open ground under direct fire from entrenched positions, a suicidal proposition even for a healthy operator with full support, let alone a half-dead SEAL running on pure stubborn will. But Mara hadn't come this far to fail now, hadn't endured the pain and fear and exhaustion just to watch her brothers die within reach. She checked her remaining ammunition, 1 AK magazine with 15 rounds, 2 grenades, her pistol with its original 15 rounds untouched, and began planning the impossible. The sky was lightening rapidly now, dawn only minutes away, and with daylight would come visibility that would eliminate her advantage. It was now or never, do or die, and as Mara settled into a firing position overlooking the cave entrance, she allowed herself one final thought of home, of her parents who thought she was dead, of Commander Hayes who'd believed in her when others doubted. Then she pushed it all away, becoming nothing but purpose and violence, an instrument of war honed by the world's finest training to do exactly this, bring her people home no matter the cost. The sandstorm that rolled through the valley at dawn was nothing short of divine intervention. A wall of dust and wind that reduced visibility to mere feet and turned the world into a swirling brown nightmare that stung exposed skin and choked anyone foolish enough to breathe without covering their mouth. The Taliban fighters hunkered down in their positions, pulling scarves over their faces, their weapons useless in conditions where they couldn't see their own hands in front of their faces. For Mara, it was the opportunity she'd been praying for, a chance to cross that deadly 200 meters without being cut down in a hail of gunfire. She wrapped torn fabric around her face, checked her weapons one last time, and stepped into the storm like a wraith entering hell. The wind screamed around her, carrying sand that scoured her already battered body, but she moved forward with mechanical determination, compass in hand, counting steps, because direction meant nothing when you couldn't see the sky. 50 steps northeast, 30 steps east, adjust for wind drift, 20 more steps, and she should be at the cave entrance according to her mental map built from hours of observation. She nearly walked past it, the opening hidden behind fallen rocks and debris, but a faint sound carried on the wind stopped her. Labored breathing, the unmistakable rasp of someone with a sucking chest wound trying to draw air into damaged lungs. Mara pressed herself against the rock face, following it with her hands until she found the gap, and then she was sliding through into darkness that was somehow more comforting than the chaos outside. Her eyes adjusted slowly, the faint light filtering through the storm revealing a cave that extended back 30 feet, and there, huddled against the far wall, were 3 figures that looked more like corpses than living men. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reeves sat propped against the rock, one hand pressed against his chest where blood seeped through makeshift bandages, his face gray with blood loss and shock. Petty Officer First Class Danny Torres lay on his side, his leg wrapped in a tourniquet that had been on too long, the flesh below it dark and potentially gangrenous. Petty Officer Second Class Jake Sullivan was the worst, his breathing shallow and rapid, his abdomen distended where infection from his gut wound was killing him slowly. Their weapons lay nearby, magazines nearly empty, water bottles long since drained, and in their eyes was the hollow look of men who'd accepted their deaths and were just waiting for it to arrive. "Contact," Reeves croaked, trying to raise his rifle with hands that shook too badly to aim, and Mara stepped into the dim light filtering through the cave entrance. "Stand down, Chief," she said quietly, and 3 heads snapped toward her with expressions that cycled through disbelief, shock, and something that might have been hope if they'd had any left to spare. "Vance," Torres whispered, his voice cracking. "But they said you were dead, we saw you fall, the drone footage showed." "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated," Mara said, trying for humor and failing as her voice came out raw and broken. She moved toward them, cataloging injuries with a medic's trained eye, and what she saw made her heart sink. These men needed a trauma surgeon, needed emergency evacuation, needed things she couldn't provide in a cave behind enemy lines with a medical kit that consisted of whatever she'd scavenged from dead Taliban fighters. But giving up wasn't an option, had never been an option, so she knelt beside Reeves first, pulling away his hand to examine the chest wound. "Sucking chest wound, partially sealed, but you've got a pneumothorax developing," she said, her fingers probing gently despite his grimace of pain. "When did you last check it?" "Hours ago," Reeves admitted. "Ran out of medical supplies yesterday. Vance, you need to listen to me. The Taliban have this place locked down tight. There's no way out. You should have kept running, should have saved yourself." "And leave my brothers behind," Mara cut him off, her eyes fierce despite the exhaustion and pain etched into her face. "That's not how this works, Chief. You know that better than anyone." She pulled supplies from the pack she'd taken from a dead Taliban medic, actual gauze, actual medical tape, even a chest seal that was exactly what Reeves needed. "This is going to hurt, but I need to reseal this wound properly." The procedure took 10 minutes that felt like hours, Reeves biting down on a piece of leather to keep from screaming as Mara cleaned the wound, applied the chest seal, and wrapped his torso tightly enough to stabilize his breathing. Tors came next, and what she found when she unwrapped his leg made her stomach turn. The wound was infected, badly, with red streaks of sepsis climbing toward his groin. The tourniquet had been necessary to stop the bleeding, but it had been on for at least 48 hours, far longer than the recommended time, and the tissue damage was extensive. She had antibiotics from the Taliban supplies, rough Soviet-era pills that might or might not work, but she ground them up and packed them directly into the wound along with fresh gauze and prayer. Sullivan was unconscious, his belly hard and hot to the touch where his gut wound had perforated his intestines, spilling bacteria into his abdominal cavity. This was the kind of injury that killed slowly and painfully, and without surgery soon, he'd die within days if not hours. "He needs a hospital," Mara said flatly, looking at Reeves and Tors. "They all do. How long since you made radio contact with base?" "Radio's been dead for 2 days," Tors said. "Last message we sent was confirming you as KIA. Command thinks we're all dead by now, probably wrote us off after the rescue attempts failed. Then Command is going to be really surprised when we walk through the front gate," Mara said with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. She moved to the cave entrance, peering out into the storm that showed no signs of letting up. "How many Taliban out there?" "Was about 30 when we went aground," Reeves said. "We've taken out maybe 5 or 6 in firefights. They've been conserving ammunition, waiting for us to die of thirst or bleed out." "Down to about 15 now," Mara said, and when both conscious men looked at her with questions in their eyes, she smiled grimly. "I've been busy the last few hours. Took out their ammunition cache, killed their commander, scattered their forces. They're disorganized, scared, and in this storm they're as blind as we are." "You did all that?" Tors asked, his voice filled with something like awe. "Alone? Jesus Christ, Lieutenant." "I had motivation," Mara said simply. She pulled out her remaining supplies, taking inventory with brutal honesty. 1 AK-47 with 15 rounds, her pistol still fully loaded, 2 grenades, some medical supplies, and a storm that wouldn't last forever. Against that, 3 critically wounded men who could barely walk, 15 hostile fighters who'd regroup once the storm cleared, and a 15-mile journey through hostile territory back to friendly lines. The smart move, the tactically sound decision that any sane operator would make, was to leave them, to promise she'd send help, to save herself because she was mobile and they were liabilities that would slow her down and get everyone killed. But SEALs didn't make smart decisions when it came to leaving brothers behind. They made the right decisions, the hard decisions, the decisions that let them look themselves in the mirror afterward. "Listen to me carefully," Mara said, turning back to face them. "In about 2 hours this storm is going to clear, and when it does the Taliban will regroup and come for us with everything they have left. We can't fight them off. We don't have the ammunition or the personnel. So we're leaving, all of us, right now while we still have the storm for cover." "Lieutenant, we can barely stand," Reeves protested. "Sullivan can't even wake up. We'll slow you down, get you killed." "Chief, I didn't survive a 40-foot fall, half a dozen gunfights, and 2 days in hell just to have this argument," Mara interrupted, her voice carrying the steel of absolute conviction. "I'm not leaving you. End of discussion. Now here's what's going to happen. I'm going to make stretchers from our weapons and whatever materials I can find. We're going to stabilize Sullivan as best we can, get some fluids into all of you from the supplies I took off the Taliban, and then we're walking out of here. Tors, you're going to lean on me for support. Reeves, you're going to help carry Sullivan's stretcher with your good arm. It's going to hurt, it's going to be slow, and we're probably going to want to quit about 1,000 times, but we're not going to quit because that's not what SEALs do." Questions? The 2 conscious men looked at each other, then back at Mara, this woman who'd been declared dead, who'd come back from the grave itself to save them. And in that moment they understood why she'd made it through Bud S when so many others had failed. It wasn't about strength or speed or any physical attribute. It was about something deeper, something that couldn't be trained or taught, only discovered when everything was stripped away and all that remained was the core of who you were. Mara Vance's core was forged from titanium and wrapped in barbed wire, and she would drag them home or die trying. "No questions, ma'am," Reeves said quietly. "Just thank you." "Thank me when we're home," Mara replied, already moving to construct the stretchers. The makeshift stretchers were crude constructions of AK-47 slings, torn uniform fabric and branches Mara scavenged from debris near the cave entrance. But they would have to suffice, because perfection was a luxury reserved for people who weren't bleeding out in hostile territory. Sullivan remained unconscious as she and Reeves carefully positioned him on the first stretcher, his breathing shallow and labored, his skin hot with fever that spoke of infection spreading through his bloodstream like wildfire. Torres hobbled to his feet with Mara's support, his face contorting with agony as weight pressed down on his damaged leg, but he gritted his teeth and nodded that he could move. The storm outside continued its furious assault on the landscape, visibility near zero, which meant the Taliban couldn't see them, but also meant Mara was navigating by compass and dead reckoning through terrain that wanted to kill them as much as any enemy fighter. She took one last look at the three men who'd become her responsibility, her brothers, her reason for continuing when every fiber of her being screamed to stop, and then she stepped out into the maelstrom with Torres leaning heavily against her shoulder. The first 100 meters were pure hell, not because of enemy contact, but because moving three critically wounded men through a sandstorm across broken terrain while dealing with her own injuries required a level of physical effort that pushed Mara beyond anything she'd experienced in Bud S. Torres' weight dragged on her injured shoulder, sending lightning bolts of pain through damaged joints with every step. While her broken ribs protested each breath she took through cloth wrapped around her face to filter the choking dust. Behind them, Reeves pulled Sullivan's stretcher with his one good arm, the other pressed against his chest wound, his face a mask of concentration and agony. They made perhaps 50 meters every 10 minutes, stopping frequently to rest, to check Sullivan's deteriorating vitals, to adjust their grip and find new reserves of strength they didn't actually possess. The storm was both salvation and curse. It hid them from enemy eyes but also disoriented them, the compass their only reliable guide as Mara navigated toward the coordinates burned into her memory from countless mission briefings. 2 hours into the journey, the storm began to break, patches of clear sky appearing overhead like windows into a world that seemed impossibly distant. With visibility returning came the inevitable discovery: Taliban fighters emerging from their shelters, reorganizing, and within minutes Mara heard the shouts as they found the cave empty and realized their prisoners had escaped. She pulled Torres behind a boulder cluster, helped Reeves drag Sullivan's stretcher into cover, and prepared for the fight she'd known was coming. Through a gap in the rocks she counted 8 fighters moving in pursuit, following the obvious trail the stretchers had left in the sand. 8 against 1, with 3 wounded men to protect and limited ammunition. The kind of tactical situation that doctrine said was unwinnable, but Mara had stopped listening to doctrine somewhere around the time she'd survived a 40-foot fall that should have killed her. She positioned her AK-47 on a stable rock, sighted on the lead Taliban fighter, and waited until they were within 75 meters before opening fire. The first burst dropped 2 men, the surprise attack scattering the others into cover, and Mara used the confusion to reposition 30 meters to the east behind a different cluster of rocks. When the Taliban emerged to advance on her previous position, she hit them from the flank, controlled bursts that dropped another fighter and sent the rest scrambling for new cover. This was the deadly dance of asymmetric warfare, one skilled operator using terrain and surprise to multiply her effectiveness against superior numbers, trading ground for time, ammunition for distance. She emptied the AK's magazine, dropped it, and transitioned to her pistol for the next engagement when 3 fighters tried to flank her position. The Sig Sauer barked twice, center mass shots at 20 meters, and 2 men fell while the third retreated behind a boulder, pinned down and calling desperately for reinforcements on his radio. Mara used the lull to fall back to where her teammates waited, helping Tors to his feet despite his protests that he could move on his own, grabbing one end of Sullivan's stretcher while Reeves took the other. They moved as fast as injured men could manage, which was agonizingly slow, every step a negotiation between pain and necessity. Sullivan's breathing had become more irregular, his pulse thready and weak under Mara's fingers when she checked it during their brief stops. Tors was fatting too, his legs swollen grotesquely around the infection, his eyes glassy with fever. Even Reeves, the toughest operator Mara had ever known, was weakening visibly, his chest wound seeping blood through the bandages despite the seal she'd applied. They were dying by inches, all of them, racing against time and biology and an enemy that wouldn't quit. The second ambush came 3 hours later when they reached a narrow defile between 2 ridges, the only passable route according to Mara's mental map, but also an obvious choke point that any competent enemy would watch. She saw the fighters positioned on the high ground a split second before they opened fire, bullets cracking off rocks around them, and she shoved Tors down while simultaneously dragging Sullivan's stretcher into a depression that offered minimal cover. Reeves returned fire with his rifle, one-handed and wobbly but still dangerous, while Mara pulled her last grenade and threw it with her good arm toward the ridge where muzzle flashes gave away enemy positions. The explosion bought them seconds, precious seconds. She used to scout an alternate route that required climbing 15 feet up a rock face that would have been challenging for a healthy person, and was nearly impossible for someone with broken ribs and a dislocated shoulder that kept threatening to slip out again. But impossible was just another word for something that hadn't been done yet, and Mara had built a career on doing things that weren't supposed to be possible. She went up first, finding handholds in the rock face, her injured leg screaming as she pushed off with it, her shoulder threatening to give out with each pull upward. At the top, she anchored a rope made from braided equipment straps and lowered it down to Reeves, who tied it around Sullivan's stretcher. Together they hauled the unconscious seal up the rock face, every pull sending fresh blood seeping from Reeves's chest wound, every meter gained feeling like a mile. Tors came next, climbing one-handed with the rope for support, his injured leg dangling uselessly, and when he reached the top he collapsed and didn't move for several minutes, just lay there breathing in ragged gasps while Mara checked his vitals and wondered how much longer any of them could continue. The answer came in the form of determination that transcended physical limitation, that place deep inside where the human spirit refuses to quit even when the body has nothing left to give. They moved through the afternoon heat that turned the mountains into an oven, through terrain that seemed designed specifically to break them, past the point where pain became background noise and exhaustion became their natural state. Mara carried Tors when his leg finally gave out completely, his weight added to her own burden of injuries creating a load that should have been impossible to bear. She fell twice, got up twice, kept moving because stopping meant dying and dying meant abandoning these men who'd already lost so much. Sullivan stopped breathing at hour 28. And Mara performed CPR on rough ground with broken ribs that grated against each other with every compression, breathed life back into lungs that didn't want to work, refused to let death claim him even though every medical textbook said he should already be gone. At hour 30, when the sun was setting again and Mara's vision had narrowed to a tunnel focused on the next 3 feet in front of her, when her hands were bloody from dragging stretchers across rocks, and her leg had gone numb from nerve damage, when Reeves could barely stay conscious and Tors was delirious with fever. She saw it through the gathering darkness. Lights on a distant hillside, the unmistakable pattern of a forward operating base perimeter. 5 miles, maybe 6, close enough to matter, far enough to be another eternity. Behind them she heard vehicles, Taliban fighters mounting one final pursuit in their pickup trucks, determined to finish what they'd started. Mara checked her pistol, found 3 rounds remaining and actually laughed, at the absurdity of it all. 3 bullets against an enemy convoy. 3 bullets to protect 3 dying men across the last 5 miles of hell. But she'd walked this far, carried them this far, bled and suffered, and refused to quit for 31 hours of continuous movement through hostile mountains, and she'd be damned if she let them die within sight of home. So Mara Vance, lieutenant in the United States Navy SEALs, picked up Sullivan's stretcher one more time, helped Torres to his feet one more time, nodded to Reeves, who was somehow still standing through sheer force of will, and began walking toward those distant lights that represented everything they'd fought for, everything they'd suffered for, everything that made the pain and sacrifice worthwhile. The Taliban vehicles roared closer. She could hear their engines now, could see their headlights cutting through the dusk, but those base lights were closer still, and Mara walked faster, limped faster, dragged her broken body and her dying brothers toward salvation with the last reserves of strength she possessed. Part 8. The Return Extended Version. The sentries on the forward operating base perimeter had been pulling 12-hour shifts for the past week, their eyes scanning the same barren landscape for threats that rarely materialized in patterns they could predict. So when Corporal James Mitchell spotted movement on the ridge at dawn, his first instinct was to call it in as possible hostile contact. He raised his binoculars, focusing on the lone figure that emerged from the mountain pass like an apparition from a nightmare, and what he saw made him freeze, made his brain struggle to process the impossible image resolving in his lenses. A single operator, uniform torn and bloodstained beyond recognition, was carrying another soldier across her shoulders in a fireman's carry, staggering under the weight with each step that looked like it might be her last. Behind her, dragged on makeshift stretchers fashioned from rifles and torn fabric, were 2 more figures, barely visible in the pre-dawn light but unmistakably human, unmistakably American, unmistakably alive when they should have been dead and buried 4 days ago. "Jesus Christ," Mitchell whispered, then louder into his radio. "QRF, QRF, we have incoming friendlies, multiple casualties, northeast perimeter. I repeat, we have incoming." He stopped, squinting through the binoculars again, his hands shaking as recognition hit him like a physical blow. "It's Vance. It's Lieutenant Vance. But she's KIA, she's supposed to be." His voice cracked and he abandoned protocol entirely, screaming down into the base. "Medic. We need medics at the northeast gate now. They're alive, they're actually alive." The base erupted into controlled chaos as word spread faster than radio transmission could carry it. Marines and SEALs pouring from buildings, medics grabbing trauma kits and sprinting toward the perimeter, and Commander Hayes running from the operations center, still pulling on his uniform jacket, because he'd been reviewing casualty reports when the call came through. He reached the gate just as Mara stumbled the final 50 yards, her legs moving on pure muscle memory because conscious thought had abandoned her somewhere around meter 14,900, her entire world reduced to the simple imperative of one more step, then one more after that. Sullivan's weight across her shoulders had become part of her, an extension of her own broken body, and when medics tried to take him from her, she initially resisted, her mind unable to process that the mission was complete, that she could finally stop, that home had been reached. "Lieutenant Vance, we've got him. You can let go now," a medic said gently, carefully lifting Sullivan from her shoulders, and the sudden absence of his weight made Mara's knees buckle. She would have fallen if Hayes hadn't caught her, his strong arms supporting her as her legs finally gave out after carrying her across 15 miles of hell. She looked up at her commander, seeing tears streaming down his weathered face, seeing an expression of disbelief and pride and grief all mixed together, and she managed a weak smile that was more grimace than anything else. "Told you I wasn't dead, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the organized chaos of medical personnel working on her teammates. Brought them all home." "That you did, Lieutenant," Hayes said, his voice thick with emotion he didn't try to hide. That you did. He lowered her gently onto a stretcher that medics had brought, but Mara grabbed his arm with surprising strength, her eyes focusing with desperate intensity. Sullivan, Torres, Reeves, are they? They're alive, all of them, thanks to you, Hayes assured her. Medics are working on them now. You saved them, Mara. Against impossible odds, you brought your brothers home. Only then did Mara allow herself to let go, to surrender to the darkness that had been pulling at her consciousness for the past 31 hours. But even as her eyes closed, she heard the sounds around her. Reeves shouting that he was fine despite clearly not being fine. Torres crying with relief and pain and gratitude. Sullivan's vital signs stabilizing as emergency trauma procedures brought him back from the edge of death. She heard boots running, heard helicopters spinning up for medevac, heard voices calling her name with something that sounded like reverence, and she let it all wash over her as she finally stopped fighting. The days that followed were a blur of surgeries and recovery, of debriefings and investigations into how the intelligence had been so catastrophically wrong, of reporters wanting the story and politicians wanting photo opportunities and Pentagon officials wanting to understand how one operator had accomplished what an entire platoon hadn't been able to do. Mara woke 3 days later in a hospital bed at Bagram Airfield, her body wrapped in bandages and casts, IV lines running into both arms, and the first face she saw was Reeves, sitting in a wheelchair beside her bed despite his own injuries because he'd refused to rest until she woke up. Behind him stood Torres on crutches, his infected leg saved by aggressive antibiotic treatment and surgery, and Sullivan, pale and weak but alive, his gut wound requiring 3 operations but ultimately survivable thanks to the CPR and field medicine that had kept him breathing long enough to reach definitive care. "Morning, Lieutenant," Reeves said, and his voice carried a weight of gratitude and respect that no words could adequately convey. "Welcome back." "How long?" Mara asked, her throat raw from the breathing tube they'd used during surgery. 3 days. You've had 2 surgeries on that shoulder, one on your ribs, extensive treatment for the shrapnel wound and infection. Doctors say you'll make a full recovery, which is more than they initially thought possible given the damage. He paused, his expression serious. "Torres, Sullivan, and I have been writing statements for your Medal of Honor recommendation. Command wants to fast-track it." "Don't care about medals," Mara said, looking at each of them in turn. "Just needed to bring you home." "We know," Sullivan said quietly, speaking for the first time since regaining consciousness. "That's exactly why you deserve it. You came back from the dead for us, Lieutenant. Literally came back from the dead." 3 weeks later, when Mara was strong enough to stand without assistance, the entire SEAL community gathered for a ceremony that had nothing to do with medals or commendations and everything to do with brotherhood. She stood before her teammates, her brothers, men who'd once questioned whether a woman belonged in their ranks, and saw in their eyes the answer to that question written in blood and sacrifice, and an absolute refusal to quit. They'd entered those mountains as teammates, some skeptical, some supportive, all professional. They'd returned as something deeper, as family forged in fire, as warriors who'd proven that courage and skill and the SEAL ethos transcended every artificial boundary humanity tried to impose. Commander Hayes presented her with her trident, the SEAL insignia that had been recovered from the ravine where she'd fallen, dented and bloodstained but intact, a physical representation of everything she'd endured. "This belongs to you," he said simply. "It's always belonged to you. You've earned it 1,000 times over." But the moment that meant the most came afterward when Reeves approached her privately, this grizzled chief who'd been one of the loudest voices opposing women in the teams, and extended his hand. "I was wrong," he said without preamble. "I questioned whether you belonged here, whether you could do what needed to be done when everything went to hell. You answered that question by carrying me and my brothers out of hell itself. I'm proud to serve with you, Lieutenant, proud to call you my teammate, my sister." Mara shook his hand, feeling the calluses earned through decades of service, seeing the respect earned through mutual sacrifice. "Just did what any SEAL would do, Chief. Brought my brothers home." "No," Reeves said firmly. "You did what the best of us aspire to do. You became a legend." 6 months later, fully recovered and back on active duty, Mara stood on the tarmac as her team prepared for another mission, another insertion into hostile territory where the odds would be long and the stakes would be high. She checked her rifle, settled her gear, and caught her reflection in a helicopter window, scarred but unbroken, tested but unbowed, a warrior who'd walked through fire and emerged stronger. The young SEALs looked at her with undisguised admiration, and she smiled, remembering a time when she'd been the one looking at veterans and wondering if she'd ever measure up. As the helicopter lifted off into the Afghan night, Mara closed her eyes and felt the familiar rhythm of rotors becoming her heartbeat once more. Somewhere out there were people who needed help, missions that needed completing, brothers who needed bringing home. And she was ready, always ready, because that's what SEALs did. They didn't quit. They didn't leave anyone behind. They walked through impossible odds and made the impossible real. The title they'd given her, the operator who came back from the dead, was accurate enough. But the title she preferred, the one that mattered most, was simpler: SEAL. Just another operator doing the job, living the ethos, proving every single day that the only easy day was yesterday. And tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own mountains to climb, its own battles to fight. But Mara Vance, lieutenant in the United States Navy SEALs, would face them with the same stubborn determination that had carried 3 wounded brothers across 15 miles of hell. Because that's what warriors did. They endured, they persevered, they won. The end.